Why did a single snarl from a subordinate wolf, pinned to the frozen dirt, manage to dictate the history of biology for 50 years? This image of raw dominance defined our entire understanding of the social lives of predators. We called them alphas. We convinced ourselves the pack was a battlefield where the most aggressive male seized a crown through combat. This concept traveled far beyond the woods, bleeding into boardrooms, self-help books, and our basic assumptions about human nature. Yet this pillar of wildlife science rested on a mistake so fundamental that it took decades of quiet observation in the deep wilderness to dismantle it. The smell of damp concrete and old iron filled a Swiss zoo in 1947. Rudolf Schenkel, a young biologist, gripped his notebook as he watched captive wolves pacing their enclosure. These animals were strangers, gathered from different regions and forced into a cramped artificial space. Schenkel recorded flashes of teeth and the submissive tucking of tails, witnessing a hierarchy of terror. He noted that the top-ranking male and female maintained status through constant, aggressive policing. His observations were meticulous, but he was documenting a prison riot rather than a society. He looked at stressed individuals with no choice but to fight for space, yet his report became the definitive manual for wolf behavior. A heavy silence fell over the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone on the 12th of January 1995. The air hit -20 degrees, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under the boots of biologists like Douglas W. Smith. They arrived to undo a century of extermination by releasing the first 8 gray wolves back into the park's ecosystem. As the crates opened and the Crystal Creek pack stepped into the wild, the scientists expected to witness the brutal power struggles Schenkel had described. They prepared for a saga of alphas and omegas, defined by constant challenges to the throne. Instead, as the weeks turned into years, the wolves revealed a story that looked nothing like the captive studies of the past. L. David Mech sat in a small spotter plane circling over the white expanse of northern Minnesota in 1970. He had just published a book that popularized the term alpha wolf for a global audience, cementing the idea of the dominant leader in the public consciousness. As he looked down at the tracks in the snow, he saw patterns that troubled him. The wolves weren't fighting for rank. They shared food and played together, moving with a synchronized purpose that didn't resemble a dictatorship. Mech, the man who literally wrote the book on the subject, realized he might have been wrong. He spent the next 30 years trying to pull his own book out of print because the word alpha was a ghost haunting a reality it could not explain. The Royale wolf-moose study began in the summer of 1958 under Durwood Allen, marking the start of one of the longest continuous looks at a wild predator population. Researchers like Rolf Peterson spent their lives on this remote island in Lake Superior, listening to howls and tracking kills. They saw packs rise and fall, but they rarely saw the ritualized combat for dominance that the textbooks promised. Instead, they saw something familiar to the human experience: cooperation born of necessity. The leader was not a tyrant who had won a series of duels. Often, the leader was simply the individual who knew where the elk were hiding or how to navigate a blizzard. In the high, thin air of Denali, then called Mount McKinley, Adolf Murie saw the truth as early as 1939. He spent 3 years living among the wolves, often crawling on his belly to get close to their dens. His report, National Park Service Fauna Series No. 5, contained descriptions of friendly interactions and communal pup-rearing. He noted that the leaders of the pack seemed to be the parents, and the subordinates were their offspring. It was a nuclear family, but Murie's work was overshadowed by the violent narratives coming out of European zoos. The world wanted a story of kings and rebels, instead of a story of mothers, fathers, and their growing children. A wolf's amber eye reflects the winter sun, seeing a world where every calorie is a gamble. In the wild, a fight for dominance is a death sentence. An injury to a paw or a torn muscle means a wolf cannot hunt, and a wolf that cannot hunt is a wolf that starves. Evolution does not favor the aggressive bully, it favors the efficient survivor. The Yellowstone Wolf Project tracked thousands of interactions, And the data was clear. The leaders of the pack were almost always the oldest, most experienced breeding pair. They didn't need to snarl to be followed. They were followed because they were the providers. The hierarchy was maintained by kinship rather than teeth. When William J. Ripple began studying the trees in Yellowstone in 2003, he found that the presence of wolves had changed the very shape of the landscape. The return of the predator triggered a trophic cascade, allowing aspen and willow to recover because elk were no longer standing still in the valleys. This grand ecological shift was not driven by a single male exerting his will. It was driven by the collective pressure of family units moving through the terrain. The alpha myth blinded us to the true complexity of these animals, making us see them as caricatures of human ambition rather than the sophisticated social creatures they actually are. The fountain pen scratched across the observation log in the dead of winter, recording a behavior that defied every rule of the old guard. A pack of 20 wolves moved in a single file line through snow up to their chests, the lead wolf breaking the trail for the younger ones behind. This was an act of service. The lead wolf did the hardest work, burning the most energy so the rest of the family could follow in its wake. If the leader were truly a selfish tyrant, this behavior would make no sense. But if the leader is a parent, it is the only behavior that matters. We have spent nearly a century looking at wolves and seeing a reflection of our own worst impulses. We took the behavior of broken, captive animals and projected it onto the wild, creating a myth that has proven incredibly difficult to kill. To understand the true nature of the pack, we have to look past the snarls and into the quiet moments of the den. We will examine the specific 1947 zoo report that accidentally created a global myth, and the 3-year field study that finally exposed the truth about who really leads the hunt. Why would a single sentence from 1947 upend decades of wildlife biology and cement a lie in the public consciousness that remains today? The alpha wolf is a myth born in a cage. Rudolf Schenkel, a Swiss biologist, published a paper titled Expressions Studies on Wolves, based on his observations at the Basel Zoo. He spent years watching captive wolves interact within a confined space and saw a world of constant, violent friction. Individuals fought for every scrap of meat and every inch of ground. Eventually, Schenkel identified what he called the alpha pair, a male and female who ruled through intimidation and physical force. This hierarchy model was clean and easy to understand. It fit perfectly with the post-war obsession with power and order. But the Basel Zoo was a powder keg. Imagine a high-security prison yard where the inmates are forced to live in a single room for their entire lives. These wolves were not a family. They were strangers, rounded up from different regions and thrown together into a small, fenced enclosure. In the wild, wolves have thousands of square miles to roam. But here they were trapped within stone walls and iron bars. Concrete and stale water replaced the scent of the pine forest. When strangers are forced into a small space with limited resources, they do not cooperate, they compete. Schenkel was documenting a slow-motion riot rather than the natural behavior of a species. The data Schenkel collected was precise, but his premise was flawed. He recorded every snarl, every notched ear, and every submissive posture. He saw a pyramid of power where the top dog took everything and the bottom dog starved. To a scientist in 1947, this looked like a universal law of nature, resembling the Lord of the Flies with fur and fangs. Schenkel wrote that the alpha was a tyrant who had won a series of duels to earn his rank. This idea was so seductive that it bypassed the usual scientific skepticism and went straight into textbooks. It told us that nature was a battlefield and that leadership was something you took with your teeth. In 1970, L. David Mech, a young biologist from the University of Minnesota, gave these ideas a global platform. In his book, The Wolf, The Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species, Mech popularized the term alpha wolf. He described a rigid social structure where young males constantly challenged the leader for the throne. The book became a bestseller and influenced everything from dog training manuals to corporate leadership seminars, we began to see ourselves in the wolf, a creature that supposedly valued dominance above all else. For 30 years, the world believed that every wolf pack was a miniature dictatorship, held together by the threat of violence. However, a different story was unfolding in the rugged wilderness of Alaska. Decades before the alpha myth took hold, Adolf Murie was trekking through the snow of Mount McKinley. He wasn't watching captives in a zoo. He was watching wild wolves in their own kingdom. Murie sat for hours in the freezing wind, his fingers numb as he scribbled notes in his field journal. He didn't see tyrants or duels for the throne. Instead, he saw a group of animals that seemed to care for one another, without the need for a lash. Murie's observations, published in 1944 as The Wolves of Mount McKinley, described a communal life. He noted how the older wolves would play with the pups, how they shared food without fighting, and how the leadership seemed to shift depending on the task at hand. There was no pyramid. There was no alpha in the way Schenkel described it. But Murie's work was overshadowed by the louder, more aggressive narrative coming out of the Basel Zoo. The scientific community preferred the drama of the cage over the quiet reality of the forest. We chose the myth of the tyrant because it was easier to film and easier to sell. The problem with the alpha theory is that it fails to explain how a pack actually survives a winter. If the leader is a selfish tyrant who only cares about his own belly, the pack should fall apart when the elk grows scarce. In the deep cold of a subarctic January, a wolf needs its companions to hunt, to keep warm, and to guard the den. A tyrant doesn't inspire loyalty, he inspires desertion. Yet, the Basel Zoo study insisted that the hierarchy was the only thing keeping the wolves together. It claimed that without a dominant leader to suppress the others, the pack would devolve into chaos. The evidence seemed to support this, but only if you stayed inside the zoo. By the late 1990s, the cracks in the alpha theory became impossible to ignore. David Mech, the very man who had popularized the term, began to see the truth during his own fieldwork on Ellesmere Island. He watched wild wolves for 13 summers, living among them in a way few humans ever had. He saw the alphas acting not like kings, but like parents. He realized that the subordinates weren't losers of a fight, they were simply the children. The hierarchy wasn't won through combat, it was born through biology. In 1999, Mech published a formal retraction, calling the term alpha misleading and scientifically inaccurate. He spent the rest of his career trying to bury the ghost he had helped create. But if the pack isn't a hierarchy, how do they make decisions? Who decides when to hunt, where to sleep, and which direction to run when the blizzard hits? If there is no king, how do 10 different predators move as a single shadow across the landscape? The answer didn't come from a zoo, and it didn't come from a textbook. It came from the longest-running predator study in history, located on a remote island in the middle of Lake Superior. There, researchers discovered that the leader isn't the strongest wolf in the pack. It's often the one that the others choose to follow for a reason science is only beginning to understand. What the index concludes: the alpha is a man-made projection of human ego onto a creature that prioritizes family over power. Why does a wolf accept its place without a fight? For 13 summers beginning in 1986, David Mech traveled to the high Arctic of Ellesmere Island. This landscape is so desolate and frozen that the local wolves never learned to fear a human presence. Mech sat on the permafrost while the wind bit through his parka to watch the white wolf pack. He did not watch through binoculars from a mile away. Instead, he sat just yards from their den. The air smelled of salt and ancient earth. He waited for the violent clashes and the bloody battles for the crown that every textbook promised. He expected an alpha to emerge from a pile of broken rivals, but the violence never came. He saw a mother nursing her young, and a father bringing home a muskox carcass. Mech realized he was watching a family dinner rather than a military hierarchy or a gang of thugs. In the wild, the lead pair are not two unrelated warriors who clawed their way to the top. They are simply the biological parents. The rest of the pack consists of their offspring from the last 2 or 3 years. This realization, published in his 1999 paper for the Canadian Journal of Zoology, dismantled the very term he helped popularize 30 years prior. The word alpha implies a rank that can be seized or lost. However, you cannot seize the rank of father from the wolf who sired you. You cannot outmuscle your way into being the mother of a litter that isn't yours. Lineage, not aggression, built this power structure. This shift in understanding changed how we interpret the sounds of the tundra. When a younger wolf approaches the breeding male, it often crouches low, tucks its tail, and licks the corners of the older wolf's mouth. To the researchers watching unrelated wolves in the Basel Zoo in 1947, this looked like a loser begging for mercy from a tyrant. They saw a submissive coward trying to avoid a beating. On the open plains of Ellesmere, Mech saw a teenager asking for a piece of food. He saw a child showing respect to a parent. The behavior acted as social glue rather than a peace treaty. It was the biological equivalent of a toddler tugging on a parent's sleeve. If the pack is just a family, the concept of the lone wolf takes on a tragic tone. A lone wolf is not a rebel or a rugged individualist looking for freedom. In the eyes of a field biologist, this animal is a homeless orphan. It is a creature that has left its natal pack to find a mate and start its own family. These wolves often travel hundreds of miles across dangerous territory. Doug Smith, who oversaw the Yellowstone Wolf Project for nearly 3 decades, tracked these dispersers using radio collars. He watched young wolves leave the safety of the Lamar Valley to venture into hostile territories where other packs would kill them on sight. They are looking for a home, not a fight. The survival of the pack depends on a lack of internal conflict. In Arctic winters, where temperatures drop to 40 below zero, energy is more valuable than gold. A wolf that spends time fighting its siblings for status will starve. Mech observed that the breeding parents rarely used force to get their way. They led by suggestion and experience. When the breeding male stood up and began to trot toward the horizon, the others followed because he knew where the caribou were. He had not bitten them into submission. It was a leadership of wisdom. The pack moved as a single, coordinated organism driven by the quiet authority of the elders. Yet, this family model introduces a biological puzzle that seems to contradict the nature of survival. If the pack is a peaceful family, why do they possess some of the most ritualized, extreme displays of submission in the animal kingdom? When a subordinate wolf rolls onto its back to expose its soft belly and throat, it offers its most vulnerable parts to a predator capable of crushing a moose's femur. This is a total surrender. If there is no threat of violence from the parents, why did evolution bake such a high-stakes ritual into their DNA? The parents are protective and nurturing, yet the child acts as if it is 1 second away from being executed. Consider the scale of the island where Mech did his work. Ellesmere is over 75,000 square miles of rock and ice, yet the wolves there survived by adhering to these rigid rituals. They lived in a world of absolute scarcity where every calorie mattered. A ritual that wastes energy would be weeded out by natural selection within a few generations. But these displays of submission have persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. They are as much a part of the wolf as its fur or its howl. If the alpha isn't a tyrant, then these submissive gestures are about something deeper that science was only beginning to scrape the surface of in the late 90s. Adolf Murray, working in the shadow of Mount McKinley in 1939, was the first to hint at this. He spent years watching the East Fork pack and documented how they cared for a crippled wolf they called the cripple. Instead of killing the weak link to strengthen the group, the pack fed and protected him. This behavior makes no sense in a dominance hierarchy, but it makes perfect sense in a family. Even Murray could not fully explain the intensity of the pack's social bonding. He saw the affection, but he also saw the shadow of a force he called the social pressure. This force kept every wolf in its exact place even when no one was fighting. The mystery deepened when researchers looked at the hormones. In a typical dominance hierarchy, the losers are flooded with cortisol. They live in a state of constant, grinding anxiety. In wild wolf packs, the data showed something counterintuitive. Often, the breeding pair have the highest stress levels. They are the ones responsible for finding food, defending the territory, and making life or death decisions. The children are relatively relaxed because they are taken care of. If the subordinates are not the ones under pressure, why are they the ones performing the most extreme acts of groveling? If the alpha is a myth and the pack is a peaceful family, we are left with a massive gap in our understanding of canine violence. We know that wolves are capable of incredible brutality. They are one of the few species that regularly engage in warfare with neighboring packs, leading to high mortality rates. If they are so cooperative within the family, where does that capacity for calculated aggression come from? The answer was not found in the way they treated their friends, but in a documented phenomenon that occurs when a pack meets a stranger, what the index concludes. Filed under the family myth.
Can a few dozen predators rewrite the physical geography of the American West? In 1995, 8 gray wolves from the Crystal Creek Pack were released into Yellowstone's Lamar Valley, an event that functioned less like a simple act of conservation and more like an accidental engineering project on a continental scale. Within years, the very banks of the rivers began to harden. Soil that had been crumbling into the current for 70 years suddenly stayed put. The water ran deeper and clearer, a biological transformation that defied every model the National Park Service held at the time. The wolves had effectively picked up the pen to redraw the map. William J. Ripple stood in the dirt of the Lamar Valley in 2003 and noticed a contradiction. The willow and aspen trees were exploding in height. For decades, these trees had been nipped down to the nub by thousands of hungry elk. Without wolves to thin the herds, Yellowstone had become a giant, overgrazed pasture, but Ripple saw trees reaching 10, 15, and 20 feet into the air. He realized the wolves were moving the elk rather than just killing them. The elk stopped lingering in the open flats where they were vulnerable and retreated into the timber. This created a landscape of fear, a psychological barrier that allowed the vegetation to breathe for the first time in a century. The smell of damp willow and the sound of rustling leaves returned to the riverbanks. As the trees grew, they provided shade, cooling the water temperature for trout. Their roots acted like biological rebar, knitting the loose mud together and preventing the banks from collapsing. The most significant shift, however, happened in the mud itself. In 1996, Douglas W. Smith and his team recorded a surge in the beaver, a species that had almost vanished from the park. For decades, only one beaver colony remained in the entire northern range of Yellowstone because the elk had eaten all the building material. Once the wolves returned and the willows recovered, the beavers followed the wood. A beaver is a landscape architect with teeth. They began felling the new willow and aspen to build dams, creating massive, slow-moving pools and wetlands. This stagnant water allowed sediment to drop to the floor, building up the valley bottom and creating habitats for muskrats, otters, and ducks. The wolves had inadvertently commissioned a massive public works project. By scaring the elk away from the water, they allowed the trees to grow, which allowed the beavers to build, which forced the rivers to stop meandering and start carving deep, stable channels. The presence of the wolf was literally holding the earth together. Ecologists call this phenomenon a trophic cascade. It is the reality of a top predator sending a shockwave down through every level of the food chain until it hits the soil and the water. Aldo Leopold had predicted this in 1949. He wrote about thinking like a mountain, warning that a mountain lives in mortal fear of its deer. Because while a deer can be replaced, a mountain stripped of its green by overgrazing cannot. Leopold saw the wolf as the mountain's protector. In 1995, his theory moved from the pages of a book into the reality of the dirt. The wolves were the regulators of a system that had been spinning out of control for 70 years. But the wolves did not stop at the riverbanks. They began to dismantle the dominance of the coyote. Before 1995, Yellowstone had one of the highest coyote densities in the United States. They were the apex predators by default, and they spent their time hunting small mammals. When the wolves arrived, they viewed coyotes as competitors rather than prey and hunted them relentlessly. Within 3 years, the coyote population in wolf-occupied areas dropped by nearly 50%. This provided a reprieve for the mice, the voles, and the ground squirrels. With fewer coyotes patrolling the meadows, the population of small rodents surged. This brought back the specialists, allowing red foxes, hawks, and eagles to thrive on the abundance of small game. The wolves were creating a more complex, layered ecosystem simply by existing. Even the bears got a piece of the prize. Grizzly bears began scavenging the wolf kills, gaining a high-protein food source that helped them survive the winter. In the summer, the bears gorged on the berries growing on the very bushes the wolves were protecting from the elk. It was a perfect, interlocking circle of energy and fear. Every death in the park became a life-giving event. A wolf kill is a buffet for the entire wilderness. Ravens, magpies, and beetles descend on the remains. The nitrogen from the carcass seeps into the ground, creating hot spots of lush green grass that can be seen from the air. Scientists like David Mech and Douglas Smith began to see the wolf not as a killer, but as a distributor. They moved nutrients from the high ridges down into the valley floors, turning the static, dying landscape of the mid-20th century into a vibrating, breathing machine. Yet, as the rivers stabilized and the trees grew tall, a new mystery began to emerge. If the wolves were such perfect engineers, why did some areas of the park refuse to recover? The willow thickets thrive in the Gallatin Range, but remain stunted in the Blacktail Deer Plateau, despite the presence of wolves in both. The landscape of fear was supposed to be a universal law. If a predator is present, the prey should run, but the data showed that the elk weren't always running. In some places, they seemed to ignore the wolves entirely, standing their ground even as the pack approached. The miracle of the Trophic Cascade was real, but it was missing a piece. The alpha logic suggested that a strong leader directs the pack to hunt, and the hunt reshapes the world. But if the pack isn't a hierarchy, then who is making the decisions? If there is no general giving orders, how does a group of animals coordinate a strike that can change the course of a river? The answer wasn't in the strength of the wolf's jaw, but in the way they talked to one another when the humans weren't listening.
How does a predator map its own family? Every morning in the sub-zero air of Yellowstone's Lamar Valley, a gray wolf performs a mental audit of its entire social world. It notes the slight limp in an elder's gait and registers the scent of a juvenile that spent the night wandering too close to a rival territory. It recognizes the specific frequency of a sibling's howl. This behavior reflects a highly sensitive social node within a neural network, rather than a soldier following a general. Science once viewed wolves as blunt instruments of instinct, driven by a simple hierarchy of muscle and teeth. But the reality recorded in the field logs of the Yellowstone Wolf Project suggests something far more complex. They possess a social brain. Douglas W. Smith tracked the Druid Peak pack for years, documenting moments that defied the old dominance models. In the winter of 2000, he observed a pack that had grown so large it should have fractured under the weight of its own internal competition. Instead, the wolves exhibited a sophisticated division of labor. One individual functioned as a specialized scout, another was a primary hunter, and a third acted as a dedicated caregiver for the year's pups. This was a cooperative, not a pyramid. Smith noted that the wolves weren't just reacting to the presence of their kin, they were anticipating their needs. They were tracking the personality of every other member, adjusting their own behavior to maintain a delicate, invisible equilibrium. This social intelligence rivals that of higher primates. When a wolf approaches another, it is reading a complex chemical and postural biography. A tucked tail or a licked muzzle is a data point. Biologists have found that wolves can distinguish between more than 20 different facial expressions and vocalizations, each carrying a specific social weight. They understand the concept of a favor and the weight of a grudge. In the 1970s, researchers like David Mech began to see that the cohesion of the pack relied on a profound level of empathy. If one member was injured, the others didn't leave it behind to die. They brought it food and guarded its rest. The cost of this intelligence is a devastating vulnerability. Because the pack is a network, the loss of a single node can crash the entire system. In 2009, when a lead female from the Cottonwood pack was legally shot outside the park boundaries, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. She was the social glue, not just a breeder. Within weeks, the remaining wolves lost their coordination. They stopped hunting effectively and began to fight among themselves, not for alpha status, but out of sheer disorientation. The pack didn't just replace her, it dissolved. By the end of the season, the group had scattered, and several members were dead. The social brain had suffered a stroke. Rolf O. Peterson spent decades on Royale, watching these social collapses play out in real time. He saw that when the population became too inbred, it wasn't just their bones that failed, it was their culture. The wolves forgot how to hunt moose together. The intricate, non-verbal cues that allowed 5 wolves to bring down a 1,000-pound animal began to fray. They lost the ability to read each other. Peterson's notes describe a pack that had become a collection of strangers. They were physically present, but the social intelligence that made them a pack had vanished. Without that shared mind, the individual wolf is merely a large dog in a very hostile world. This raises a question that has haunted field biologists since Adolf Murray's time in Denali. If the pack is so fragile, and the loss of a leader so often leads to total collapse, why doesn't it happen every time? Nature rarely bets on a system that breaks so easily. There must be a failsafe, a mechanism that allows the social brain to reboot itself when the unthinkable happens. In 2012, researchers began looking closer at the Omega wolf, the individual at the very bottom of the social ladder. Traditionally, this wolf was seen as a scapegoat who took the brunt of the pack's aggression. But the data revealed a different story. The Omega was a peacekeeper. When tensions rose between siblings or parents, it was the Omega who initiated play and diffused the aggression before it could turn into a fight. In many ways, the lowest-ranking member of the pack held more power over the group's survival than the leaders themselves. If the leaders provided the direction, the Omega provided the stability. They were the shock absorbers for the pack's collective stress. When the Omega was removed from certain study groups, the entire pack's cortisol levels, the hormone linked to stress, skyrocketed. This discovery turned the alpha myth on its head once again. It suggested that power in a wolf pack flows from the outside in, not from the top down. Every member, from the nursing pup to the aging grandparent to the playful Omega, contributes a specific frequency to the pack's internal harmony. They are all monitoring each other all the time. They are aware of the group's collective health in a way that humans are only beginning to quantify through heart rate monitors and GPS collars. They are a single, distributed organism. But even this realization doesn't explain the most bizarre behavior ever recorded in the Lamar Valley. In the winter of 2015, a pack was observed doing something that should have been biologically impossible. A rival pack had killed their lead male, the father of the group. According to everything science understood about wolf biology, that pack should have scattered. They should have been absorbed by their rivals or starved in the deep snow. Instead, they stayed. They didn't fight, they didn't flee, they waited. Then, they did something that no textbook had ever described. They didn't look for a new leader among themselves or a new territory. They turned toward a lone wolf that had been trailing them for weeks, a stranger, a disperser from a distant pack. Usually, a stranger is met with immediate, lethal violence. But this time, the pack opened its ranks. They recruited him rather than just tolerating him. This single event challenged the very definition of what a wolf pack is. If it isn't a rigid hierarchy, and it isn't just a nuclear family, then what exactly was this stranger providing that was worth more than the pack's own genetic purity? What the index concludes: the wolf pack is not a kingdom or a family, but a living archive of survival strategies that can be rewritten in an instant to prevent total extinction. Why would an 80-pound wolf challenge a bison weighing 2,000? The math of survival in the Yellowstone winter of 1997 worked against the predator. A bison represents a mountain of muscle and prehistoric rage, armed with hooves capable of crushing a wolf's skull in one strike. To bridge this physical gap, the Druid Peak Pack developed a strategy that Douglas Smith and his fellow researchers observed with growing disbelief. This was a sequence of cascading decisions rather than a chaotic brawl. Each movement served as a calculated test to find a microscopic flaw in a massive wall of meat and horn. The wolves watched for a limp, a labored breath, or a momentary lapse in focus that signaled the end of a life. The hunt often began in total silence. Douglas Smith and his team watched from a distance as the pack fanned out in a wide, mile-long arc across the Lamar Valley. The temperature sat at 20 below zero, making the air feel brittle. Unlike humans, who rely on shouted commands or hand signals, the wolves moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They did not bark or howl. Instead, they communicated through body language and spatial awareness that functioned like a biological local area network. If one wolf accelerated, the others adjusted their angles instantly to corral their target. In the winter of 1998, a specific hunt lasted for 4 days of relentless psychological pressure. The wolves did not attack immediately, standing just outside the bison's strike zone and remaining motionless for hours. The bison lowered its head, horns pointed at the perimeter, in a stalemate of endurance. The wolves were waiting for the bison's internal temperature to spike, or for its muscles to stiffen in the biting wind. This was the strategy of the long game. A wolf can lose 90% of its hunts and still survive, but a bison only has to lose once. The strategy relied on a phenomenon known as the test chase. A wolf would dart toward the herd to provoke a reaction rather than to bite. If the bison stood its ground, the wolf retreated. If the bison ran, the hunt was on. David Mech recorded instances where wolves would ignore a stationary elk just 5 feet away, only to pursue one that bolted 100 yards out. Running triggered something ancient in the wolf, but more importantly, it revealed the prey's physical condition. A healthy elk can outrun a wolf in a sprint, but a sick or injured one cannot. The wolves were sorting the herd like a high-speed algorithm. When the pack finally committed, the formation shifted into specialized roles. In the Royale study of 1966, Durward Allen noted that certain wolves always took the lead while others stayed back to cut off escape routes. There was no barked order from an alpha. Each individual seemed to know its own physical limits and its place in the maneuver. One wolf might focus on the nose to distract the bison, while 2 others targeted the hindquarters. This was a high-stakes gamble where a single misplaced paw meant a shattered rib cage. The snow was often stained with the blood of both the hunter and the hunted before the final moment arrived. The most baffling part of the hunt happened during the final strike. In 2004, observers in Yellowstone's northern range documented a pack of 16 wolves taking down a bull elk in deep snow. As the elk slowed, The wolves did not rush in all at once. They took turns. While the lead wolves engaged, the others sat in the snow with tongues out and steam rising from their fur in the morning light. They were rotating their frontline fighters to maintain peak intensity. It was an assembly line of predation. This level of tactical patience contradicted everything science thought it knew about the supposed bloodlust of the wild. This coordination suggested a level of cognitive planning that troubled many traditional biologists. If the pack was not a hierarchy of bullies and victims, as the 1947 Basel Zoo study suggested, then what was the glue holding this tactical unit together? It wasn't fear of a leader, which serves as a distraction in the heat of a bison hunt. They were moving as a single organism with multiple sets of eyes and ears. They were sharing a mental map of the terrain, using the deep snow of the coulees to trap animals twice their speed. They were using the landscape as a weapon. The success of the pack was built on an invisible currency of trust. When a wolf lunges at the throat of a kicking elk, it does so with the absolute certainty that its packmates are securing the flailing hooves. Without that certainty, the hunt collapses. This isn't the behavior of unrelated subordinates forced into a gang, but the behavior of a family protecting its collective future. Every calorie gained from a kill is a calorie invested in the next generation. The alpha myth suggested the leader ate first because he was the strongest, but the reality was far more pragmatic. By the early 2000s, the data from Yellowstone and Royale was undeniable. The wolf pack was the most sophisticated hunting unit on the planet because of its social cohesion rather than its teeth. But as Rolf Peterson watched the Royale population begin to flicker out, he noticed something chilling. The hunts were failing. Even with plenty of moose, the wolves were losing their edge. They were still fast and strong, but the invisible communication was breaking down. The synchronized arc was fracturing into a series of uncoordinated, desperate lunges. The breakdown wasn't caused by a lack of food or a lack of leaders. It was something deeper, hidden in the very blood of the wolves. As the years passed on the isolated island, the pack's strategy became suicidal. Wolves were attacking prey they couldn't possibly kill, and they were doing it alone. The family unit was dissolving into a collection of strangers who no longer understood each other's signals. The question wasn't how they hunted, but why the ability to hunt together was suddenly vanishing from their DNA. What happens to a predator when it forgets how to speak to its own kind? What the index concludes: the wolf's greatest weapon is not the jaw, but the social intelligence that allows a family to function as a singular lethal mind. Did the biting winter air of 1947 distort what Rudolf Schenkel saw through the chain-link fences of the Basel Zoo? As he sat hunched over his notebook, he watched a group of wolves brought together from different regions, strangers forced into a shared and cramped reality. Schenkel saw them snarl, pin one another to the concrete, and engage in a desperate struggle for resources. In his resulting report, he described a rigid social hierarchy, where the strongest male and female fought their way to the top to become the alphas. This observation felt intuitive to a post-war world obsessed with power and rank. However, Schenkel was not looking at a natural pack. He was observing the equivalent of refugees in a prison camp, and the behavior he recorded was trauma rather than biology. The alpha myth took root in the public consciousness like a weed in fertile soil. In 1970, L. David Mech published his seminal book, The Wolf, which popularized the term for a global audience. It provided a framework for leadership that felt rugged and primal. We applied it to our offices, our gyms, and our own families, believing that nature demanded a tyrant at the helm who ruled through fear. But even as the book became a bestseller, Mech realized the data from the wild did not match the data from the zoo. While the captive wolves in Basel were busy tearing at each other for status, the wolves in the vast expanses of the northern wilderness were doing something entirely different. By the summer of 1986, the cracks in the alpha theory became impossible to ignore. Mech spent 13 years on Ellesmere Island, living among wild wolves that had never been hunted or trapped. He sat on the tundra as the wind whipped off the Arctic Ocean and watched a pack through his binoculars for hundreds of hours. He saw no violent coups or subordinates groveling for the right to eat. Instead, he saw a mother and a father. He saw a nuclear family. The leaders were not the strongest fighters, but simply the parents. Their authority did not come from a clenched jaw or a pinned shoulder. It came from the fact that they had provided life to every other member of the group. The math of the wild is far more elegant than the math of the cage. In a real wolf pack, the alpha, male and female, are the biological heads of a household, and their followers are their sons, daughters, and cousins. When a young wolf reaches maturity, it does not challenge its father for the crown, it simply leaves. It wanders hundreds of miles across frozen rivers and through dense timber to find its own mate and start its own family. The aggression Schenkel saw in 1947 resulted from forcing unrelated adults together in a space where they could not escape. It was like putting 8 strangers in a locked room for a decade and assuming their bickering represented the natural state of human society. In 1999, L. David Mech did something rare in the world of science by publishing a formal retraction in the Canadian Journal of Zoology. He stated clearly that the term alpha was misleading and scientifically inaccurate when applied to wild wolves. He spent the rest of his career trying to pull his own book from the shelves, but the myth had already escaped the lab. It had become a cultural juggernaut and a justification for aggressive posturing. We wanted the wolf to be a mirror of our own competitive vanities, but the reality was far more humbling. The wolf is not a general leading an army. It is a father teaching his children how to survive a winter that wants to kill them all. Consider the 1995 reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone's Lamar Valley. Douglas W. Smith and his team didn't see a scramble for dominance. When the Crystal Creek Pack stepped out of their acclimation pens, they saw a coordinated effort to feed the pups. They saw the lead pair voluntarily giving up the best cuts of a kill to ensure the next generation grew strong. There was no beta waiting in the shadows to strike. There was only a division of labor. The older siblings helped babysit, and the yearlings learned to hunt by watching their mothers stride. It was a system built on trust and genetic legacy, not on the end of a fang. This shift in understanding changes everything about how we view the natural world. If the wolf is not a tyrant, then the law of the jungle isn't about the strongest crushing the weak. It is about the most cooperative ensuring the survival of the collective. When we look at the 1,939 field notes of Adolf Murray from Denali, we see descriptions of communal pup-rearing that were ignored for decades because they didn't fit the alpha narrative. Murray saw the truth before the myth was even born. He saw a species defined by its capacity for grief, its memory of territory, and its unwavering loyalty to its kin. The alpha is a ghost that haunts our understanding of biology. It is a reminder of how easily a single flawed study can distort our perception of reality for nearly a century. We remember the 1947 zoo report because it gave us a simple, violent answer to a complex question. But the 3-year field study on Ellesmere Island gave us the truth. The lead wolf is a provider, a guide, and a protector. When a pack moves through the deep snow of a mountain pass, they move as one unit, bound by blood and the shared warmth of the den. They do not fight for the right to lead. They lead because they are the only ones who know the way home. The archive of the natural world is full of these corrections, moments where the evidence finally outweighs our assumptions. We once saw a monster in the dark, a cold-blooded killer obsessed with rank. Now, through the work of researchers like Mech, Smith, and Peterson, we see a creature that mirrors our own best instincts. The wolf is a model of social cohesion that has survived for millions of years, not through the exercise of power, but through the maintenance of family. The myth of the alpha has been filed away, replaced by the reality of the parent. The snarling captive has been replaced by the wild provider. The true nature of the pack is not found in the violence of the cage, but in the silence of the hunt and the communal howl at dusk. We looked for a king and found a father. We looked for a hierarchy and found a home. The evidence is now undeniable, recorded in decades of telemetry data and thousands of hours of field observation. The wolf is no longer a symbol of dominance, but a testament to the power of the family unit in the face of an unforgiving wilderness. What the index concludes is that the alpha wolf does not exist in the wild, only the parent. Subscribe a new breakdown like this every day.